Hi all, welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's Whitney Witch. Today is going to be the part 2 of my coming out video, and so there are some things that I wanted to talk about kind of before I got into that. So the reason I'm making this video is because I have gone through a lot of questioning of my gender identity and the way that I'm feeling and why, and I spend a lot of time researching and looking to others and seeking, advice from others and talking to people and just trying to get an idea of, where I fall into the gender category, because it's not always made a whole lot of sense to me. And then the other thing I really want to discuss is there's a lot of talk about sex and gender in our society and in our culture. And those terms are used very interchangeably, but they are not at all the same thing. They're related, but they're not the same. And so I kind of wanted to take a minute to discuss that real quick, and then I want to talk about the gender identity stuff. I don't know about y'all, but I definitely had a gender revelation through this crazy pandemic. And so I just wanted to share kind of where I'm at now, and we'll go from there. So hope you enjoy and hope you learned something today. So, all my life, I've really struggled with my gender identity. When I was little, I never really fit in with the guys. I wasn't ever into like typical boy things like hunting and fishing and sports and cars and all these like boy manly types of things. It never really caught my interest or was something that I was ever, really into at all. I always felt like kind of like one of the girls, I just happened to click and connect with girls, in my classes and stuff better. I always, had a lot of women and girls in my friend groups. I just always seemed to resonate with them and feel and think a lot more like they did. I always had an affinity for women's clothing and makeup, and I was just always a very feminine person. I was sometimes made fun of for being like too sensitive or too emotional and being too soft. When I was a kid, I wasn't a very tough kid or like a manly type of person, and I was okay with that. That's just how I was, and honestly how I've always been. I've always just been a very sweet and sensitive person. And I can remember back when I was little, I always envisioned myself with a guy. I never spoke about it, but I always envisioned myself with a guy. And I knew at a young age that I liked the same sex, and that I was attracted to guys. But whenever I envisioned myself with a guy, I always envisioned myself in more of like the feminine role, or like kind of the wifey role. And then eventually at some point down the road, kind of like the mom parent role. So I've always kind of had this weird relationship with my gender and how I've felt about things and how I've envisioned myself. And for the longest time, I struggled with it, but I never really talked about it. And then I got to college, and it was a bit of a culture shock, because like I said, I grew up in a really small town, and talking about anything LGBTQ was just not a thing. But when I got to college, I not only experienced for the first time just like the world that was out there, I also got into drag, and I mean really got into it. I fell in love with it. I was just an avid watcher of RuPaul's Drag Race, but I also followed a lot of queens, on YouTube, and all the makeup tutorials, and just the culture and the humor that I got out of it was just really, really fun. But I ended up experimenting with drag. I bought makeup, I bought clothes, and I toyed around with different looks and different, ways to present myself. And, I kept that mostly a secret. There were some people I shared that with, but for the most part I kind of kept it a secret because I really wasn't sure, you know, what that meant for me at the time. But what I did know is that dressing in women's clothes and putting on the makeup and appearing, very feminine and pretty on the outside was just a very liberating experience. It was a very good thing for me. And in a way, it made me feel on the outside a lot of the ways that I felt on the inside. And then after college, I continued to kind of explore my gender identity, and I kind of toned it down a little bit. It wasn't quite as I wasn't doing as intense of makeup and looks as a drag queen normally would. I wanted it to look more like campy and casual and like just your everyday kind of like feminine looks. And I realized that it wasn't just about the clothes for me or presenting as a character. It was more about presenting the way that I felt on the inside. It meant more to me to just express how I was feeling and expressing that feminine side that I had. And so at that point, I kind of started playing around with my gender identity, really questioning like, am I really? Do I really feel like a guy most of the times, or is there more to this? And so I started identifying as gender fluid because there were moments where I would feel more masculine and more manly, and then there were a lot of moments where I felt more feminine and more like a female. And so, but it was never consistent. I would always flow kind of between the two, and so gender fluid kind of felt like the best that I could describe myself. It's been interesting to see how people perceive me and how people notice things about me right off the bat. As I have met new people and as I have strengthened friendships and such with people that I've already known, I have noticed that a lot of people, and I don't know if it's because, I've identified as gay or because I'm just an effeminate person, but a lot of people just naturally gravitate towards like feminine pronouns with me. And it's never bothered me. And I honestly quite enjoy it. And I've noticed recently that hearing he, him, and masculine pronouns just feels kind of weird to me. And I have recently started to express that feminine side of myself again. There was a period of time where I shut that part of me away as an adult, and I was just like, no, I don't need to do this. This isn't right. This is weird. And so I shut it down. But in the last year, I've kind of re-explored that. Therefore, I've done a lot of research on gender and trying to find a way to best describe the feelings that I have about who I am. And so I wanted to formally say that I identify as non-binary, but more specifically bigender. Again, I have always struggled with feeling like one particular gender or the other. It's always been a mix for me of male and female. I sometimes have days where I am perfectly comfortable with the body that I'm in and the way that I look, and I feel comfortable being called he, him. But then there are some days when I feel a lot more effeminate, and I really, really am disgusted by my body, and I want to look more feminine, and I just get very frustrated with the way that I look and that I don't look more like a woman on the exterior, and I would prefer to go by she, her pronouns. It's very confusing. But I've always known that I've definitely felt a blend of feminine and masculine. And so that's why I've really recently come across the term bigender, and it really resonates with me and really describes at the best the way that I feel. It's been really exciting to finally find, a term to really describe the way that I feel, because gender fluid kind of fit for a while, but it wasn't quite right for me. But then I came across non-binary and then bigender, and I was like, wow, this totally makes sense. That totally clicks. And I've seen other YouTubers that are bigender, and I've read articles about what it means to be bigender, and it makes a whole lot of sense. Like I flow between both genders often, and it changes often, and it's very hard for me to describe that and verbalize how and why I feel the way that I feel. It's tricky, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I've said at the beginning of this video, gender is a very personal thing, and it's an internal thing, and it's once you kind of figure out how you feel and why and can put a name on it, it's very, very satisfying and exciting to kind of finally be able to say, wow, this is me, this is it, this is what I'm feeling. In my last video, I talked about the disaster that I had coming out the first time, and so I have recently come out again to my mom about my gender identity, and I was legitimately shocked in a good way at her reaction, because she was like, I mean, yeah, it pretty much makes sense. And she was like, but if this is the truth, then it is what it is. And I was like, oh, okay, wow. And she was perfectly like, cool, like whatever, you've always been you. And I just thought that was incredible. We always fantasize, ways that we hope our coming out will go. And the first time around, it was really rough. It was awful. But this time around, it was completely different. And I just wanted to throw that in there, that people do change, and that situations change. And, it might have taken a while, but we got there. And it's been very exciting to not only embrace this side of me, but kind of get that confirmation and validation. And now I feel like I'm ready to take on the world in all of my beautiful bigender non-binariness. So I'm excited to see where this takes me, and I'm excited to see how I change and evolve from here on out, because I'm fully going to embrace this, and I'm going to wear the clothes that I feel like wearing that day, and maybe throw on a little makeup or whatever, but I'm gonna express myself however feels right to me. So I'm really excited to see where things take me. In the meantime, let me explain to you a little bit about what non-binary is and what bigender is and what all of these other gender identities are that you may come across. And hopefully I will clarify some of these things for y'all. So let's talk real quick about the difference between sex and gender. Sex is your external description at birth of how you appear to look. Typically, that is either male or female. However, there's always an exception to the rule, and there are some people that are born with a blend of both attributes, and those people are called intersex. But sex, in general, is the physical description of a person at birth. Gender has to do with the internal feeling of somebody. It's how you identify, how you feel on the inside. It could be male, it could be female, it could be part of both, it could be neither of those things. But your gender identity has more to do with how you conceptually identify as a person. So let's chit chat real fast about the gender binary. In many cultures and societies, there's this idea that everybody can be separated into the category of either male or female. And for many people that works, but for some people that is not necessarily the case. As I said, sometimes the gender identity does not exactly align with the sex assigned at birth. Let's talk a little bit about how people can differ from this binary concept and what these different identities can mean. So for a lot of people, their gender identity or expression often does not align with their sex assigned at birth. And so that brings me to the first big term that I want to talk about. So this is the transgender flag. and on in the middle I've got the transgendered symbol. So transgender is, again, anybody whose gender identity or expression does not explicitly align with their sex assigned at birth. And so whenever you have that conflict between sex and gender, that's called dysphoria. And so for a lot of people that are, outside of the binary, as we like to say, those two things clash a lot. And so we have to express ourselves or present ourselves in a way that feels more correct to what's going on in here. Gender dysphoria can be really frustrating and stressful and disorienting. And so for a lot of people that are transgender, they go through a transition typically from one side of the binary to the other. Transgender in general really can apply to anybody that falls outside of the gender binary. So not everybody necessarily will use this term, but just know that this is pretty much kind of the opposite to the binary. So before I continue with the other types of non-binary gender identities, I want to take a second to point out intersex. This is the intersex flag. These types of folks are people that are born with a blend of both male and female attributes. It could be a genetic thing, it could be a chromosome thing. Sometimes they're born with both male and female reproductive parts. And these folks can identify as male or female, or sometimes they will identify differently. It's again, gender is a felt thing. To people that say that gender is simply based off of the sex that you're born with, well, what do you say to these folks? Because that has to be extremely confusing. So just be aware that these people do exist and are out there, and they choose to identify with whatever gender that they are comfortable with, because again, gender is a felt experience. So the next gender identity that I want to talk about is non-binary. So as you see, these are the non-binary colors, and this is one of the symbols to represent non-binary folks. There are a lot out there because, again, non-binary is anybody that falls outside of that gender binary. So that can look like a lot of different things. For some people, they could identify partially with one gender and not the other. For some folks, they may not identify with any gender identity. Sometimes people can identify with multiple gender identities or change and flow between different gender identities. So non-binary is a very large umbrella term, and it looks very different between person to person. So just be aware that it's kind of a broad thing, and there is no harm in asking that person the way that they'd like to be addressed or identified, because non-binary is just a very, very personal thing, and it's a very unique experience to that person. There's no one specific way to look or identify as a non-binary person. I also want to take a second just to note that gender identity and gender expression aren't necessarily the same thing. While somebody may feel a particular gender, their expression of that gender may not necessarily manifest in an outward appearance. So I just want to make that very clear, that even though somebody identifies with a particular gender does not necessarily mean they have to dress or appear a certain way. That is completely up to them and whatever they feel and whatever makes them most comfortable. You cannot judge somebody's gender identity simply off of appearance. It's just one of those things you have to get to know about a person. So within non-binary, there are a couple gender identities that I'd like to point out really quick. The first one is agender. This is the agender flag, and again, one of the symbols to represent agender folks. These people do not identify with a particular gender. A lot of these people tend to be more androgynous, or just don't wish to present any particular way. They just want to be seen as a person. So another gender identity that falls in the non-binary category is bigender. Bigender, this is the flag, and this is one of the symbols to represent bigender. Bigender folks are people that flow between two particular genders. While the flag does have pink and blue, which represents feminine and masculine, it doesn't necessarily mean that these people are explicitly feeling feminine and masculine, and that's how that works. No, by gender, bi meaning two, just means somebody that flows between two particular gender expressions or gender identities. Another term that is used to describe people that fall outside of the gender binary is genderqueer. This is the genderqueer flag, and then this is one of the symbols that can be used to define genderqueer folks. This particular term is similar to non-binary in that it basically describes folks that do not explicitly identify as male or female. These people can kind of be a blend of the two, or they might not be either of them. But this is also kind of another umbrella term to define somebody that does not necessarily fit into the gender binary. This term also sometimes can be used by people that they're questioning their gender. Another term that you should probably be aware of is demigender. This is the demigender flag, and these are two symbols to represent demigender folks. Demigender, demi being the prefix that means some or partial. These people partially identify with the gender, and while these two symbols are, as you can see, this is the Mars male symbol and the Venus female symbol. These people partially identify with one of these genders. Again, it could also be a different gender identity, demi meaning partial or some. But this is a term that I have come across a lot in my research, and it's one that I have heard being used a lot more recently. Again, our vocabulary and our definitions of gender are evolving and changing. And this is a really interesting one that you may come across. And it simply means somebody that partially identifies with a gender identity. Okay, the last gender identity that I want to hit on in this video is gender fluid. So as you can see, this is the gender fluid flag. There is not really a symbol to define gender fluid because it's kind of another broad term within the non-binary category. Gender fluid is somebody that flows between various gender identities. Now you may say, well, isn't that exactly what bigender is? Yes and no. Bigender, again, means somebody that flows between two particular genders, whereas gender fluid, these people can flow through many different gender identities. They might feel agender one day, they might feel more non-binary one day, they might feel more masculine one day, they might feel more feminine one day, they might feel a blend of the two, more bigender. It just depends. These people, their gender identity it's always changing, and they're flowing between those things. I hope you got something out of today's video. I hope that I was able to clarify for you a bit more on the difference between sex and gender. I hope that you are now more familiar with some of these gender identities so that when you come across folks that are using these terms to describe themselves, you have a better idea of what it is that they are going through, and the ways that they're describing themselves makes a bit more sense to you. That being said, if you saw a painting today in this video that you really liked, whether it was the flag or the symbol or something, if you saw something you really liked and you want one, by all means reach out to me. I am all for commissions. I am all for painting and doing fun crafty things. So if you would like a painting for yourself, feel free to comment on the video or reach out to me. I'll be sure to put my email in the description below. If you would like to commission a painting from me, I would be more than happy to do that for you. Last but not least, going forward, I will continue to identify as a non-binary person, but within that, I most closely vibe with bigender. My pronouns are pretty much going to be she, her, or he, him. I'm okay with either of those. I will say I have a preference for she, her pronouns because that feels more right to me and feels more correct to me. However, it will not bother me in the slightest if you use he, him pronouns. But just be aware that that's kind of how I'm feeling and kind of what's working for me right now. And it may change, but for now, this is what I'm rolling with. So I appreciate you for taking a minute to watch this video. And I appreciate you for taking a minute to understand my journey. And remember, guys, do no harm, take no shit. Love y'all and take care, and we'll see you next time.